By this time on Sunday morning, I have about 5 ways to start a sermon. So at this point, this is the 6th one maybe. I don't know how this works out. But in any event, one of the writers, in fact, every Sunday I get her email, a blast. It's called From the Cottage. I don't know if you ever have heard of or seen Diana Butler Bass. She sends this out, and usually she has a reflection on the Sunday scriptures. Well, this Sunday she was a bit ticked off at something and didn't have a reflection on the Sunday scripture. But in any event, I've become somewhat of a fan of her writings. I like how she writes. I like how she sees things. And one of the books, it might be something for future book reading here, to consider, is a book that she kind of wrote in a similar fashion to what Brian McLaren wrote about Christianity and whether Christianity is going forward or not. But the title of her book was Christianity After Religion: The End of Church and the Birth of a New Spiritual Awakening. And one of the things that she does in the middle of the book is describe how over the centuries Christianity has morphed into putting belief first, then putting practice, and then putting belonging. So that what was important is that we have an understanding of what we believe, and then we practice it by observing the rules and regulations, if you will. And then we might have a sense of belonging in community or somewhere. Perhaps more from a Protestant perspective, the belonging was always first an individual thing, right? Me and God, or me and Jesus. But growing up in the Catholic tradition, I never thought of myself as an individual with reference to God or Jesus, but more in reference to Jesus and God through the community, through the life of the community. But in any event, she says this is how it's developed. Putting a belief first, then putting practice, and making sure that we practice what we say we believe, and then a sense of community afterwards. And that gets a little expendable after a while as to whether we really have any sense of community or need any sense of belonging to be who we are as Christians. And that's a whole debatable question. But how she does it is she says, you know, for Christianity to survive, it really needs to be flipped around the other way. And what needs to be flipped is that we put belonging first. That we have a sense, a stronger sense, a better sense of what it means to be in relationship with each other and what it means to be a community. That's the priority, especially given the world that we live in today. And she wrote this about 10 years ago, so I could imagine what she might say about the world today. And I do know on Sundays when I read her thing, I have a sense of what she's thinking about the world today. But she says to put belonging first, and then to put the practicing second. In other words, that when we're in relationship with each other, it becomes important to practice being in relationship. In other words, it's not just something we talk about, but it's something that we're going to do and live and be in living with it together. And then will come the belief. In fact, this is, as I just think about it today, a very ancient maxim that how one worships, how we worship, in other words, when we gather together in community around the table of Jesus, that how we do that speaks volumes about what we believe. In other words, we don't believe first and then come to the table. We're first gathered around the table in fellowship with each other and Jesus, and then that's going to say something to the world about what we believe. Now, the reason why, keep that in mind, that as Christianity has developed, that it puts belief first, then practice, and then community or belonging. She's inviting us to put it the other way, to put belonging first, then to put the practice, and then to put the belief. Not that belief is not important, but belief will flow from how we are in community with each other and how we're practicing it out so that get that contrast between it. The reason why I set that up that way is because running through my mind over the last couple of days has been, well, let me give you a little bit of historical context, all right? You know that that's what I like to do, is to provide historical context. If we take Jesus and the audience of Jesus in first century Judaism, that it's clear that the focus of Jesus' teaching and preaching and life is the reign of God. But what happens is that as we move to the next generation, the writing stage, where the Gospels come into being, that what we see is that Jesus becomes the center. So that we have now in the Gospels Jesus as the center who talked about the reign of God. So that we're already kind of moving the focus away from reign of God and how Jesus talks about it to now Jesus, and maybe we might have an interest in the reign of God. Well, as it keeps developing, that by the next generation, by the third generation, and now we're into the mid-100s and mid-late 100s, that it's the church talking about Jesus, talking about the reign of God. So that now the concerns, the layers that get put onto it, is you see how now we're moving towards that belief, right? That it's going to become important that the Christian community has a sense of who Jesus is, and that becomes the effort of gathering in community. Who Jesus is, what Jesus is about, what we need to be as church, and how we're going to be that as church. And oh, by the way, he talked about the reign of God, but you see, it's more focused on Jesus. And then, if you go later than that, it becomes the church talking about the church, who talked about Jesus, who talked about the reign of God. So that by the time we come into the late 100s and the mid-200s and all the way into the 300s, that we're already more interested in the beliefs, the dogmas, the doctrines, if you will, than we are in changing our lives and conforming to this vision of the reign of God that Jesus talked about. Now it's conforming to the church, to how we are to be church, and what's expected of us in terms of church. So there is a marked difference moving focus-wise from Jesus' teaching and preaching to the followers of Jesus in the Gospels, putting Jesus at the center of their teaching, then the church at the center of the church's interests, and oh, by the way, now we're going to add in Jesus and maybe the reign of God. And then it's church issues. And you know what the church issues are going to be, right? Making sure that we got bishops and making sure all of these. And you can see what happens, so that within 300 years, people haven't got a clue as to what the preaching and teaching of Jesus is about. It's more like, well, what does Father say? Or what do the bishops say? Or what does the Pope say? Well, they didn't have a Pope quite yet at that point. But in any event, you see the change in the focus and the teaching. So it's no wonder that Diana Butler Bass says that we move from the belonging to the beliefs. So that by the middle of the 2nd century, by the middle of the 100s and moving into the 200s, that we're more interested in beliefs. So let me introduce this, and if you ever have a crossword puzzle that these names come up, fantastic, because then you'll know who they are. Or if you ever get on Jeopardy and the question comes up, and by the way, one time it did come up, so I know these are real things that I'm saying. But one of the people, and I'll give you the phrase in a moment, but one of the very early leaders in the Christian community was a fellow by the name of St. Irenaeus. Anybody hear of St. Irenaeus? Probably in Protestant Christianity, you're not going to hear about St. Irenaeus. But in any event, I say that seriously because it was nobody before Martin Luther that you really cared about for a long, 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 long time. Martin Luther was the beginning, and whoever came before him wasn't of any consequence because they were all Catholic. You know how that works, right? All those Catholics. So Martin Luther and after that was the only thing that mattered. But we've been rediscovering the ancient leaders and speakers and preachers and teachers of early Christianity. Well, St. Irenaeus is in the early 100s and actually ends up being martyred around about 177 in the present era. But St. Irenaeus is sent from the province of Asia, probably either Ephesus or Smyrna. Smyrna is modern-day Izmir in Turkey. Ephesus, its port city today, is Kuşadası. In case you're ever on a cruise through the Mediterranean, please do make sure that you stop in Kuşadası to get to Ephesus. It's fabulous. But in any event, Irenaeus grows up in Smyrna, or in that province of Asia, in that part of modern-day Turkey. He is a disciple, here's the second name, a disciple of St. Polycarp. And St. Polycarp happens to be a disciple, and this is pretty much for sure, St. Polycarp happens to be a disciple of John, who becomes the writer of the Gospel of John. So there is a direct link between John, Polycarp, and Irenaeus. Now we're not that far off, probably about 100 years, but it's important to know that this apostolic link from Irenaeus to Polycarp to John is very important. Because as Christianity develops, it becomes a kind of an underlying issue or agenda that we have to somehow keep a connection to Jesus. That it's not really to the church per se, but it's a connection to Jesus. Well, as the Catholic tradition develops, and even into modern Protestantism, that there is an understanding that we can, in some ways, trace who the current leader of the church is, maybe the current bishop, that we can trace them all the way back to the apostles. Because that somehow gives credibility, lends credibility to what they're preaching and teaching about. It also gives, obviously, in the Catholic tradition, a great deal of authority to what they're saying and what they're speaking. If they speak in the voice of the apostles, then somehow or another we should have some confidence in what they say, some certainty about what they say. But in any event, here's another aspect of the historical context, that Irenaeus and the teachers and preachers in the middle 100s find themselves in a situation where, as Christianity moves out of Palestine and moves out of its connection and roots in Judaism into this Hellenistic Roman-Greek world, that it finds now that the philosophers, the preachers, and the teachers of the ancient Roman Greek religion somehow are calling the question on the Christian preachers and teachers. So you get up, Irenaeus, and you speak and you preach about Jesus. Well, you need to make sure that you're firmly rooted in philosophy and in all the understandings that we are. And Irenaeus says to those people, who the heck do you think you are? I don't have to be rooted in your Greek philosophy. I'm rooted in this. And so they have this contest going back and forth, and they're still writing where they have sat in some kind of a discussion room, never on Zoom, but certainly in some kind, where they've argued with each other. They go back and forth. This is who I am, this is what I believe, this is who we are. Why do you believe? And you see how this contest goes on, so that it's sort of like, Carla, in your speech thing, it's like one of those debates. You know, and in spite of the fact that today we have no sense at all what a true debate is, hint, 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 I'm not going to talk about that, but in any event, that there was a real debate. And when you debated the other party, you couldn't just say, as some of my nurses keep thinking. I had a nurse just at the beginning of the class that I'm at. She says, so you don't respect my opinion? I said, excuse me. I said, this is an academic course, and when you give your opinion, you have to back it up with some references and some resources. Otherwise, I don't want to have you as my nurse, because if you base your nursing on mere opinion, forget it. I'm not going to be your patient. Then I remembered later, I said, well, nursing, and they all tell me this, nursing is based upon evidence. Well, when you give your opinion, then you have to provide backing and evidence, and what you're saying is connected somehow or another to a reference or a resource or a credible reference or resource. So this is what's happening, that Irenaeus finds himself in a situation where he's have to now make use of the Greco-Roman philosophical language and system to argue Christianity that was not rooted in that kind of philosophy or that kind of understanding of the world. And so it's forcing the Christian teachers and preachers to push themselves out of their comfort zone into a world that maybe they might not be comfortable in, but have to very quickly find comfort in it. Because boy, if the opposing person on the other side realizes that you are speaking very weakly on your position, they're going to get you sooner or later. They're going to discover that you haven't got a clue what the heck you're talking about. And they're going to push the issue with you. And you see, they both have audiences also that they're trying to speak to. And so the Greek side says, you know, if I can get that person's weakness, do you think anybody's going to believe what that person has to say? No. Nobody's going to believe it. If you can't argue your position logically, reasonably, applying and making use of all the resources that you have, if you can't do that, then why would anybody believe what you have to say? Irenaeus and the others, Polycarp in particular, realizes that, and so they have to learn the language, they have to learn the line of argument, they have to figure out how they're going to do all of that. And being smart people, they manage it pretty well. So Irenaeus' argument is with, and here's some other Jeopardy questions and answers. Irenaeus is arguing with a group called Gnostics. How many have heard of Gnostics? Oh, well, there we go. Now everybody's into that, right? And I'm not going to spend time talking about the Gnostics. I'm not quite sure that I understand what their view is. But in any event, Irenaeus is arguing with the Gnostics. And the Gnostics say certain things about their beliefs, certain things about the universe, certain things. And Irenaeus goes, yeah, well, that's really wonderful. But you know, I believe, and then Irenaeus begins to speak about his belief. And in the middle of it comes a phrase that he's arguing with the Gnostics, and he wants the Gnostics to understand that, quote, as in my nursing class we spend the first week talking about, that there really is a worldview that Christianity has. That there's a way that we understand the universe. And by the way, all of this is accessible. It's not some secret information like the Gnostics had. All of this is perfectly accessible by anybody who applies logic, reason, or sits and has a conversation with somebody who believes this. Then pretty soon you have an understanding of what this worldview is about. Irenaeus says, we have this worldview, and this worldview clearly articulates not only how we understand the universe working, but it also clearly articulates how God is a part of this creation, this universe. But we also have a very specific way of understanding how humanity, how human beings relate to the divine, and therefore how we connect and relate to the universe. So that's basically how Irenaeus argues. And he comes down to this point. He says, you know, he says, I hear you talk about human nature or the human person, and I don't get it. And the reason why I don't get it is because in my worldview, I understand that the human person is clearly, as Genesis tells, and he may even quote the text from Genesis, that Genesis says that the human person is made in the divine image and likeness. You all know that, right? Everybody raise your hand if you know that, right? That's one of the cardinal principles of the Bible and the cardinal principles of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. That the human person is made in the divine image and likeness. Irenaeus said, now, well let me say, so the Gnostics, or anybody he's arguing with, says, oh, wait a minute. We see the human person as being characterized, natured-wise, defined by the world in which they live. So basically, that worldview is going to suggest that the human persons are defined by where they live, the color of their skin, the kind of jobs that they have, the house that they live in. Now I'm really pushing the example, but that's basically what the other side is saying. Irenaeus says this. He says, no, that's not true. That's not right. The human person is always going to be defined by God. But even more than that, it's not an external definition. Rather, it's an internal reality. So that within the human person is a part of divinity, if you will, and what defines the human person is the way in which that divine life in the person is activated in the way that they live within the world. So it's not that the world shapes and defines human persons, but rather it's the interior relationship that the person has with God that defines the human person. And here's the phrase. And this is getting to the first reading in Exodus and getting to the gospel. Irenaeus finally says this. He says, you may know this phrase, I may have used it already over the past few years. He says this. He says, the glory of God is the human person fully alive. The glory of God is the human person fully alive. Now, that's said in reference to the contrast, whatever that might have been, with the heretics and the Gnostics on the other side. He says this. He says that the amount of life within the human person is evidence of the glory of God. That's another way to say the phrase. So however fully alive the person is how much glory of God is seen. Not just in the person, but how much glory of God is seen around them. So that it comes from the aliveness of the human person, and the more life that is in the human person, the more glory of God will be discovered. So if you want to know who God is, do you know this phrase out of Les Miserables, right? It's towards the end of Les Miserables. You know, that when you see another person's face, what do you see? The face of God. That's what the idea is. So that as much as you are alive and the glory of God is emanating from you because of what we see, is how others will come to know who God is. It's not by some theological, philosophical, out there. It's rather what's inside. And when we come to have contact with what's inside is how we're going to, one, come to know God. So Irenaeus is also speaking to his audience by saying, you know, it's not by the doctrines and dogmas, it's rather how you live that matters. And how you live is going to give evidence to who God is and what God is about. I hope all this logic is making sense. Therefore, in the Exodus reading, it's very clear, and I know I've used this phrase quite often, not quite as it is today in the text, but there's another place where it's said this way. Moses says, show me your glory. Show me who you are. Now, obviously, that's going to be very hard for God, right? Because God isn't material. There's no physicality. There's no material aspect of God. And Moses wants to have some idea. And God says, you know, I'm only going to do this. I'm going to pass by you, and when I pass by you, you will hear, Lord, Lord, slow to anger, rich in mercy, abounding in kindness, steadfast in love. More or less what the text today says. So that here the understanding has to be, if we can get the connection or make the connection, is that glory has to do with slow to anger, rich in mercy, abounding in kindness, steadfast in love. Now, I tell you that because if you read the e-Sojourner this week, you see the word in the text for glory is doxa. Doxa. That's the word in Greek for glory. Well, if you read that in the e-Sojourner, you see how doxa gets used it's not just about glory. Now doxa becomes, as it translates over into Latin, doxa becomes doctrina. And doctrina very quickly comes into doctrine, into the substance of what's believed. Now I hope you see that I gave you that history of the development within Christianity, that does seem to be how Christianity moves. That it has to do with understanding that God's glory is understood by you memorizing the questions in the catechism and by you being able to repeat back what you learned in the text. That's glory. Well, that's not it at all, is it, I hope you see. That the glory of God is not in memorizing text or even in the text themselves. The glory of God is found in slow to anger, rich in mercy, abounding in kindness, steadfast in love. Which has to do with, if that's what's inside, then you see it's absolutely necessary that that's what others see in me, because that's the essence of God, that's the character of God in me, is being slow to anger, rich in mercy, abounding in kindness, steadfast in love. So when Irenaeus says that the glory of God is the human person fully alive, he's implying that aliveness has to do with taking on the character of God. That we are as alive as we can be, meaning the fullness of being alive. That when the human person is fully alive, they are fully engaged in being slow to anger, rich in mercy, abounding in kindness, steadfast in love. That when we are doing those things, or being those things, then we are fully alive. And hint, 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 if we're not doing those things, then we're not fully alive and we probably are dead. And I know a lot of people walking around who are dead. So you see, here's the connection to the gospel. The connection to the gospel has to do with this, the contrast. And I'm not going to get into taxes, and I'm not going to get into Caesar, but here's the thing, that Jesus is presenting them with a contrast between the worldview of the emperor and Caesar and Rome and the worldview of God. And the contrast has to do, you think you are alive in Caesar's world. You think because you drive a nice car and live in a big house and have lots of money in your bank account, you think you are alive. And Caesar has convinced you you are alive. Because why? Because Caesar has to say, you want to be more alive? Then indulge in more pleasure and more wealth and more and all of that. And we buy into that, don't we? We think that we're better human beings, stronger human beings, wiser human beings, richer human beings, because of all the material. And Caesar has bought us in hook, line, and sinker. And you just listen to the rhetoric on the TVs. Just listen to just listen. That's exactly all the argument. Buy this bath soap and you will be such a great person. Your skin will be smooth, and boy, they will just be running after you. Right? Isn't that true? Right? You hear that, right? Just think, go down that whole line of thinking, and everything, almost everything that we hear has to do with aliveness being defined by what we do, what we have, where we live, what we contribute to. Jesus says, wait a minute. Give to God what's God. Well, what is it? What is of God? This worldview says, you want glory? It's not found in your titles. You want glory? It's not found in where you live. You want glory? Then be slow to anger, rich in mercy, steadfast in love, abounding in kindness. You want glory? That's how God, that's what you got to give to God, what's already inside of you. Every single one of us has all of that inside of us. Because if we believe the story that we are in the divine image and likeness and that God is in us, then that's already in every single person. Even the murderer on death row, it's in that person. Even the worst person that you could imagine, that's in that person. Problem is that Caesar's world may not ever let that person show it. That person has also, the murderers and the rapists and the robbers and the child abusers and whoever else, that they also have bought into Caesar's world. And maybe have never heard about the world view of God. Well, why? Have they ever experienced anybody being slow to anger with them? Have they ever experienced being forgiven? I tell the nurses often who say that they work in prisons and they say this is the hardest job that they've ever had, is to work in a prison, and know that as nurses they have to provide the same kind of care to the murderers and rapists and drug abusers and child abusers. They have to provide the same level of care to those persons as they would anybody else. And I say, you know why? Because you might be the first and only person that will ever say to them, you are in the divine image and likeness. They might never have heard that before. And you might be the first one to open the crack in the hardness of their shell and the hatred and the anger of their lives. You might be the first person that opens just a little crack that allows in the glory of God, allowing it then to come out. Who knows? Maybe, maybe not. Doesn't matter. You just do it. Why? Because that's what it means. So, the contrast, again, thinking back to the idea of Irenaeus, if we want to be fully alive, hint, 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 it's not to buy into the world of Caesar. If we want to be fully alive, then live what's inside of you. Slow to anger, rich in mercy, abounding in kindness, steadfast in love. If you want to be fully alive and have glory in your life, then live in that life of God that is already inside of you.